I mic'd? Can everyone hear me? All right. Thank you, Nancy, for that very generous and charming introduction. Thank you to Pioneer Works and to Brooklyn Research. So yeah, as Nancy said, I'm a computer and video game historian. And the talk that I'm going to be going over with you, or the talk I'm going to give today, I've had a couple beers, it's fine, is going to be more so focused on kind of the history of the personal computer. And it's going to be a talk about chronic pain and the personal computer, which has been like a personal interest of mine for some time. So I want to begin with a letter. So in the ebbing days of 1980, Henry Getson of Cherry Hill, New Jersey, wrote a letter to his favorite computer hobbyist magazine called Soft Talk. Now, Getson described himself as a computer user of, quote, less than expert status. And he expressed to the editors his appreciation for Soft Talk's introductory tone and its accessibility, especially for someone like him, someone who was new to learning to program. His letter closed with a short question. A stray thread dangled from the hem of his heaping praise. He asked, P.S., have any remedies for tired eyes? It was a question legible to Soft Talk's editors, who responded at length to what they called a problem that many computers share. Some relief comes, they wrote, from double folding a washcloth, saturating it with warm water, and holding it against your eyes for several minutes. In later issues, fellow readers volunteered their own tips for dealing with eye strain. So a reader from Cypress, Texas wrote in and recommended that Getson modify his screen with a piece of plexiglass covered in that, quote, sunscreen material found in auto stores. Another reader from Malibu, California, suggested that Getson should buy light green theatrical gel sheets, the kind used to color stage lights, and tape them over his monitor. What Getson was discovering, like all the rest of the personal computer early adopters of the night, at least someone thinks this is funny, all right. Warm it up, crowd. Was what he was discovering, like all the early adopters of the PC in the 1980s, was just how much using computers hurt. So it turns out that monitors cause eye strain, or more accurately, the assemblage of computational life routinely strained eyes. So vision problems were the embodied human residue of natural interactions between light, glass, plastic, color, and other properties of the surrounding environment. So when overhead lighting, strong task lighting, or daylight cast from behind a user hit the curve of a monitor, the result was glare or reflection over the display's specular surface. The 20th century had a strong tradition of using overhead lighting. It was optimal for paperwork, accounting, reading, all the traditional tasks of office labor. But these produced a variety of lighting issues that negatively affected human vision when that human was positioned in front of the dark glass of a computer monitor. So this was a world of pain previously unknown to man. There was really no precedent in our history of media interaction for what the combination of sitting and looking at a computer terminal did to the human body. So unlike television, right, which we might think of as an analog, it was done at a greater distance and it lacked interaction. Monitors required a really short depth of field, and it also required repetitive eye motion in a way that television did not. And while computers had been used in military installations, government research labs, and universities since the 1940s, those were mainframe and mini computers. So first they were used by a much smaller subset of specialists, and they had a different organizational relationship to the body. They tended to be marked by standing rather than sitting. The use of a monitor as a peripheral was not mainstream during this time, and the output of these machines was actually printed, usually. Computers, for most people who used them, were processing machines, digital technologies that outputted results rather than manipulated data in real time. So it was only with the arrival of the desktop computer at the tail end of the 1970s that the computer usage took on the bodily postures we associate with computing today. The constant bend of the wrist over a keyboard, the staring at a screen, and slightly later, the nudging of a mouse. And it was in the 1980s that computer practices among the administrative white-collar workforce and among a general consumer public began to take shape en masse. So as the icon of the industrial worker of the mid-20th century gave way following mass transformations in the US economy in the 70s. So essentially, America lost its position as an industrial economy due to recession, inflation, a kind of pitched global energy crisis in the 1970s. the computer became not just an object increasingly integrated into office work, read the captions, they're amazing, but a handmaiden to a new generation of freewheeling information workers, right? Being called upon, or empowered, as we might think, to master their own domestic and occupational work through the centralizing and rationalizing capacities of the personal computer. So as computing terminals proliferated in work, schools, and homes over the 1980s, chronic pain became their unanticipated remainder. Wrist pain, vision problems, and back soreness grew exponentially. Oh, that guy on the floaty is my favorite.
Is that Jay Leno?
No, it's just some guy, right? So while Getson's small question might be easily overlooked in the hundreds of letters and articles that cycled through 1980s computer magazines, for me, this letter offers an alternate terrain for thinking about the dramas of computational life in the 20th century Western world. So the history of computing, if you do something like Google computer history timeline, you get a lot of arrows and things like this, right? A lot of just like objects, lined up in a row. Apparently nothing happened between 1939 and 1971, right? But it's very kind of iconic mode of organization. This way of, it's a teleology, we might say, right? This trajectory that more or less neatly chronicles these dramatic technological watersheds as a timeline of famous hardware and software and their inventors. So if I was to ask you, tell me what you know about the history of computing, right? You might respond by naming people or particular kinds of technologies, right? You might think of Steve Wozniak and his peerless Apple II, Gates's opaque Windows.
What?
There's a whole set of these. There's one where he's like flicking floppy disks in a very sexual way at the camera. They're great. Google sexy Bill Gates and you'll find them. I dare you. Right? And of course, Steve Jobs' insatiable appetite for invention. Yet for all those computerists with tired eyes, computer culture isn't what happened on screen or in a box, but it was what happened everywhere else, right? With, on, and around keyboards, televisions, joysticks, desks, offices, kitchens, tables, beds, hands, glasses, light bulbs, windows, back supports, and on. Domestic computing, right, the simple reality of a computer entering the home and being taken up by its inhabitants, enabled or required dramatic affordances amongst the population at large, whether those changes were to household lighting, to learning how to tolerate chronic discomfort, or the circulation of new domestic imaginaries. So this is a way for me to kind of like rewrite what we think the history of computing is, right? This isn't a history of like killer apps and wild hacks and coding bros who stay up all night, right? This is something that's quiet and hard to trace, right? It's about history that is both intimate and in some ways unhistoric, right? Histories of habit, use, and making do. So computers brought with them questions, right? Where do we put it? What do we put it on? How do we use it, protect it, and take care of it, right? There hadn't been a new appliance in the American household since the television of the 1960s, right? So answers to these questions arrived in the form of secondary industries, right? Entire genres of companies selling everything from computer furniture to dust covers and glare protectors. It also inspired a world of hacks and schemes, advice traded between friends and office workers for how to make computer use less painful. This was a very common way of hacking a computer terminal in the office, was to just tape a box over the fucking thing and put your head inside of it to use it, right? So that you could cut the glare from behind you. So for me, this is a story of how the computer became personal, right? Not a story of computers becoming like smaller, lighter, faster, better, but a story of how we learn to live with computers. So to locate a history of computing that could be otherwise, right? One that's embodied, habituated, and distinctly spatial, right? We would do well to think about Getson's letter and consider what kinds of histories of computing might be lying around the computer rather than inside of it. So what I want to do here in the time that I have is give an account of the history of personal computing that in another way is kind of a history of the body. So computer-related pain and the astounding efforts we will go to alleviate it, manage it, and negotiate it have provided for me one thread through the question of how the computer became personal. So the introduction of computers into everyday routines at work and at home was a historic site of vast cultural anxiety around the body, and the problem brought itself to near immediate attention. So as early as 1981, which is just 1 year prior to Time magazine declaring the personal computer the 1982 machine of the year, it was the first time they had ever made a thing rather than a person, the thing of the year. The Journal of Human Factors was publishing research on the relationship between job stress, health complaint, and the use of video display terminals, or VDTs, in clerical work. And so the researchers distributed questionnaires to employees at 5 different companies who were required to use VDTs, basically a sort of monitor and keyboard setup. And they distributed the same questionnaire to workers who were engaged in the same kind of work, but were doing it manually. So they considered that the control group, workers who were using typewriters and traditional indexing. And so aside from gathering demographic data and asking questions about job stress, the questionnaires asked the participants to document an exhaustive range of visual, musculoskeletal, and emotional health complaints. In every category of health complaint, from fainting to stomach pain to neck pressure to hand cramps, the percentage of complaints went up among workers stationed at computers, often doubling, tripling, or quadrupling in number. I think the burning eyes, blurred vision, and eye strain are some of the, you got 80, 71, and 91, right, being reported by clerical workers, and about half that amongst anyone who was the control subjects. So, and some of the strong disparities between clerical workers and the control subjects, which would include like changes in color perception as well as stiff or sore wrists, like 47-7, were clear indicators of the impact of the soft repetitive strain of computing. But there was another component to health complaints and stress that the social scientists picked up on, but they didn't quite know what to attribute it to. In assessing levels of stress and job satisfaction between the clerical workers and the control group, the researchers determined that clerical employees using computer terminals reported higher degrees of monotony and fatigue and job dissatisfaction versus those performing the same work without a computer. So this led the researchers to conclude that while computing terminals did impose increased physical stress on workers, there was something else going on that seemed separate from anything that could be ascribed purely to the postural and visual strains that accompany computer use. And what these researchers were encountering in their data was the kind of residue that quantitative analysis isn't well suited to explain. And answers to this would have to wait until the publication of Shoshana Zuboff's landmark 1984 monograph, In the Age of the Smart Machine, The Future of Work and Power. This is an outstanding book, if you've never heard of it. It's an ethnographic account of the impact of computer usage in work environments in the 1980s. So Zuboff's book is a masterpiece of organizational workplace ethnography, in which she uses participant observation and interviews to assess how are people experiencing changes to their work once the computer becomes its intermediary. So Zuboff's investigations revealed where the psychophysical costs that shadowed the computer's entry into the workplace. In her very grimly titled 4th chapter, Office Technology as Exile and Integration, Zuboff spent time observing administrative office sites, specifically a dental insurance company and a stock brokerage, where computers had just become integrated into clerical work practice. And so prior to the arrival of computer terminals, the women who handled these tasks, and I'll discuss in a moment, it was importantly almost always women who were on the front line of these transitions. They described having a very material relationship to their work. They retrieved actual files, they filled out pieces of paper, they moved folders back and forth between filing cabinets, they updated files by hand, they left notes for themselves, and manipulated the intricacies of their files based on personal knowledge of their clients, accumulated know-how, and consultation with their fellow coworkers. The arrival of computers onto the desks of these workers was done so with the intention of streamlining and speeding up the work these women engaged in by evaporating all those small physical habits associated with their work. The walking and the talking, the shuffling of paper, the flipping of pages, the personalized practice of self-annotation. But this effort to kind of simplify these routines by making the office paperless, the implementation of the computer wound up eradicating the basis of the clerk's situated knowledge. So suddenly, making changes to a client's account meant simply inputting data in an order that was constrained by the computer itself. So work became fill in the blank, right? There was nowhere for the clerks to any longer experience decision-making in their jobs. So what Zuboff wound up tracking was that as intellectual engagement went down, the necessity of concentration and attention went up. What the computer did was make the work so routine, so boring, so mindless, the clerical workers had to physically exert themselves to focus on what they were even doing. And so this transition from work being about the application of knowledge to work being about the application of attention turned out to have profound physical and psychological impact on the workers themselves. And Zuboff was able to track the extent of this toll by asking the clerical workers to draw pictures of themselves before and after they experienced the computer.
Wow.
So I don't think I have to say a lot here, right? I think these images sort of reveal themselves, right? Embodying a kind of juvenile terror in their stark lines and their simple contrasts, right? The workers depict themselves as happy in the times before the computer, frequently in the company of others. What the computer brings them is a kind of desolation, right? A worker who's become nothing more than the back of her head. Hair ripped from the scalp. A deep sense of being alone. One of the most detailed drawings is accompanied by a caption, quote, "No talking, no looking, no walking. I have a cork in my mouth, blinders for my eyes, chains on my arms. With the radiation, I've lost my hair. The only way you can make your production goals is to give up your freedom." The side of the desk, right, is marked by the ascending arrow of a productivity chart. And another image depicts the worker in the striped uniform of a convict. A phone rings on the desk. A flower in the vase droops beside the computer. It's very sad. The calendar is empty and her supervisor watches her from above. A sign intended to be inspirational, "Keep up the MPH," right? Suggests the new emphasis on speed that the clerical workers have been asked to internalize. So I suggested earlier that gender played an important role in the integration of the computer, especially in the office. And it was women's bodies who first hit the wall of these transformations. So I think that, and this might seem kind of contradictory, right? I think our contemporary cultural moment has placed a lot of emphasis on gender disparity in technological occupations, leading us to believe that the world of computing has existed as this sort of undifferentiated boys' club. And that's an interpretation that really needs some nuance. When computers first came into the office, they were aligned with clerical work, as the tasks that would have been first computerized were those that involved functions like data entry and word processing. So knowing how to type, which was, right, doesn't it look like the worst? Which was a prerequisite skill for using a computer, was the domain of clerical laborers. In fact, the uptake of the computer within executive and managerial strata was actually slowed by the cultural association of typing as fundamentally secretarial. And of course, these kinds of practices were reinforced in school systems where touch typing was a skill taught to women but not to men. If you've ever seen a really old program, they often do a thing called hunt and peck, where they type with their index fingers because they were never learned how to touch type. And so it's actually not until the mainstreaming of the mouse in the 1980s that these tensions were able to be technologically negotiated. So using a mouse, a male executive could operate a computer without the demeaning posture of being a typist, right? And so this dynamic shows up a lot in advertising from the period, which often men at computers are like pointing at a screen, or they're just kind of like in the presence of a computer, but they are not to be caught dead doing that demeaning secretarial work of actually like putting in data themselves. Ooh, okay. So the health of the information worker became a property of increasing concern within the workplace. And so if the point of all these expensive computers was to speed up processes, to allow everyone to be able to do more, then the blossoming of all these new forms of bodily pain was an obvious impediment to the agenda of productivity. And so around the mid-'80s, you see emergent attention to the science of ergonomics and human factors in the information workplace. This is testified by all sorts of publications that came out of this time. One of my favorites is Zap, How Your Computer Can Hurt You and What You Can Do About It, which presented the office as an ecology. This is an illustration from this book. in which relations between monitors, keyboards, lighting, chairs, air quality, and work schedules had to be endlessly manipulated to acquire one's perfect workstation for what they called safer computing. So, and one of the more delightful artifacts I found on my journey through the lost history of computer pain, all right, is this booklet, which I really enjoy. This is Tone Up at the Terminals, an exercise guide for high-tech automated office workers. For those of you who aren't familiar, Denise Austin was a popular fitness personality of the 1980s and 90s. She had her own workout show on ESPN. And so this booklet was part of an entire corporate fitness program that Denise Austin promoted, in which your company could pay Denise Austin to come in and teach your employees how to do these exercises. And so what Denise does is sort of take you through, step by step, right, a pattern of exercises focused on different areas of the body. And this gets especially great because Denise never leaves her chair. It's one of my favorite parts. Right? And so it gets sort of increasingly absurdist by sort of never actually suggesting that the worker would like leave the workstation, right? And if we think about these, the illustrated response of the women that Zuboff was studying, right? In contrast, there's this emphasis on being non-disruptive, on not taking up space, of maintaining the possibility of immediately being able to get back to work, right? This isn't like advising you to take a walk. This is advising you to like continue sitting down and do exercise, right? And of course, in your like 3/4 length skirt with a very, discreet split up the front, right? And of course, you end with a hug, right? Wow. You deserve it, okay. So what all of this adds up to is a decades-long drama between body and machine. So probably not since the automobile had there been a technology that so insistently reorganized how we use our bodies in day-to-day practice. And the long arc of these transformations are still being played out. So as those of us in this room are kind of the first generation of humans to come of age on the computer, the toll of this is now persistently being felt in the commonplace reality of carpal tunnel syndrome, chronic back pain, and vision problems among a workforce just beginning to hit middle age. And the negotiations continue with whole new industries blossoming in the form of standing desks and walking desks, adjustable keyboards and ergonomic mice of every stripe. Our aggrieved bodies have been a boon for voice recognition. This whole talk was written with voice recognition. And the lure of computer technology hasn't ceased to bend us to its will in new ways, right? So with the emergence of text neck as the new vogue ailment, one day we're all going to have one of these, Nancy. We're all going to have a curve restorer that you like, through which it's terrifying, right? So this is actually like a device meant to help put curvature back into the neck as an antidote to the process of constantly staring down at your phone, which has been a real good thing for chiropractors. So the smartphone's insatiable demand on our attention is just the latest in a long dance between our psychic and emotional health and the computer. So the posture of the head tilt, right, is an index to the encumbrance of multitasking, right? If you Google image search multitasking, like all the images look like this. It's amazing. It's just like cell phones exploding with apps, right? A term now synonymous with what it even means to use a smartphone. So to slide between applications, to flick our attention from one priority to the next with no delay for context, the seemingly seamless movement we now engage in as we nudge between our personal and occupational lives. Multitasking was once something that belonged solely to the realm of the computer. It was a technical term, referring to the capacity for time-sharing systems to concurrently process the operations of multiple users by switching back and forth rapidly between jobs. But it was over the course of the late 1980s and 1990s, with the rise of the graphical user interface and the increasing gigification of the US workforce, that the term multitasking came to be applied to human labor, to the idealized state of being able to work on multiple tasks more or less simultaneously. So maybe the long arc here is that the doldrum of Zuboff's clerical workers has become the sort of endless noise of habituated computer use. And so by way of a conclusion, I'll say that as a historian, I'm not much in the business of proposing the solutions, right? That's your business. But rather in combing the historical record to undermine the narratives that have been presented these technologies to us as inevitable and innately positive. right? So the next time I would hope to think that you experience tired eyes, right? Let it serve as a denaturalizing reminder that the function of technology has never been to make our lives easier, but only to complicate us in new ways. Right. Thank you.
Laine, that was fantastic. Thank you.
You really enjoyed it.
I did. I mean, the bulk of the work that I make is actually in response to my own personal, just anger with the computer.
That's basically what this talk is about for me, right?
Yeah, it's about your anger. Does anybody have any questions quickly?
Oh yeah, I can answer questions.
I don't know. I mean, do you want
Or was that just like too much of a downer? Was that?
Can you comment on the 80% irritability on that survey? That was amazing.
Yeah, I think that I'm trying to remember the exact context of that. I mean, I think that that was one of the like psychological issues that came in with computer use that had more to do with the kind of stuff Zuboff was talking about, which is this sense of loss of control over your work, and the fact that that plus the idea that you were supposed to be doing everything faster made everyone way more agitated. Like people just felt really cranked by these machines. So the machines, it was like, yeah, I can do this work faster, but like I don't feel like I'm doing anything at all, right? And so like the way that their bodies are experiencing what this computer is forcing this to do, I think was an extremely alienating experience for them.
I mean, even today, I can say I feel that, right? And I didn't even have clerical work before. Is there another question?
Yeah, I just had a quick question on your last point, and you said, I think your quote, it's a great quote about not the purpose of technology, but technology, complicates us in new ways. And if you could just juxtapose that real quick against like the idea, I mean, technology's been around since we've started inventing things, right? So can you juxtapose that against like, especially in the physical form, against the natural state? Like I can think of things like shoes as a technology, and there are people that run barefoot because they think it's better for your body to run barefoot. So like broad strokes, this idea that technology complicates our lives in new ways, is that, how do you feel about that in the abstract against like the natural state of humankind?
I mean, I don't think there's any proposition for a natural state of humankind. Like for as long as we've had technology, we've also been working, right? And we've always been putting our bodies into new postures. I think that kind of the sort of gesture at the end is more. I was thinking about my students a lot when I wrote that, which is, they'll spend a whole semester with me, and then at the very end they'll still be like, but the purpose of technology is to make our lives easier. And I'm like, oh, I failed. If like that's what you took away from this class, like fuck, like it's really just this perpetual cycle of, okay, now we have a new set of problems to negotiate, right? So in one moment it was like the profound monotony of using these machines, and now it's actually the kind of information overload, right? The sort of the multitasking phenomena, and the way that I think like amps us and jerks us around both physically and psychologically. Yeah. Oh, okay, all right.
Well, we can always expect at the adoption of new technologies for there to be these kind of complications, right? And these questions. And so this was like a great look at that dawn of kind of personal computing entering the workplace. And but I was wondering, does your work also prognosticate at all? Like, where do you see now that we've moved past some of these problems, or what do you see as the future of work or the future of technology?
I mean, I think I think that like obviously these problems have only maintained, and if anything, become naturalized, right? Like the number of people I see around my office wearing a wrist brace, like it isn't anything at all, right? The rise of like, who doesn't know somebody who works with a standing desk at this point? Like there's just this constant reapplication of techniques to kind of manage ourselves against these machines. But I think the moment where you capture its newness is really important, right? Like what the reason I like going back to the early 80s is because no one had ever experienced these things before. And like that's a moment where you can actually, like these conversations that are also secondhand to us now, you can actually find kind of crystallized at the moment that they actually become a discourse, right? And so like that's what's really interesting for me. I don't think it's going to get any better, right? I think it's just going to get weirder in different ways.
So you don't see the future of clerical work as being suspended in an anti-gravity tank with a VR
I mean,
headset?
what is the future of
moving
clerical
things
work,
around
right?
like that?
It's Amazon Turk, right? It's like outsourcing our labor to like third world countries where like I can only I imagine it's not that different from what a VDT operator in the early 1980s was going through. Actually, that's the future of labor, right? Sorry, that was I went on a tear there, but yeah, that's. I mean, I think that it's the increasing disparity of like what kind of work requires what kinds of attention, right? And I think that that has become a real dividing line in where different forms of computational labor get outsourced to.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche's typewriter was like this like weird.
It was an
ball
orb.
type.
Yeah,
So like
yeah.
when he was typing, he was actually kind of doing like this like evil villain kind of thing, which is great. Yeah, I think about these like sort of like codependent sort of like we're in the ecosystem's determining us, we're determining the ecosystem, and I think about like you've done a really great job of showing that history with the physical body and situated knowledges and stuff like that. But I think about like people are asking about AI, and it's like no, like we use AI every day when we make a Google search, and Google has actually taught us how to look for
Yeah.
information.
Yeah.
And so it's like interesting that there's like this like crossover where like our intellectual and emotional ecosystems are also adaptive.
Yeah, we are products, we are co-produced by these technologies, right? So like I learn how to be a subject by using them, and they subjugate me in certain ways, and it's this constant process of like tension and negotiation, right? I'm pretty certain that like my students don't think the way I think, right? Like their ability to like sustain attention on a singular object is shot, because like all they do is like move between like 1,000 different registers at a really, really quick pace. And those are the kinds of things we wind up talking about, is actually like what has multitasking like actually done to your brain, right? And what has it like trained you to do? Not in this kind of, oh, it's so much better in the way that I do it, but like can we actually think about what the habit of these technologies does to us over time, right? What feels a comfortable way of doing work versus what doesn't?
I was just going to ask about, like, we talked about how these computers were introduced in, like, a professional setting for clerical work, and, like, all these women are miserable. But, like, is there a honeymoon period where, like, at first the computers were, like, a very exciting, fun thing, kind of like everyone loved having a smartphone, and now you're reading books like How to Break Up with My Phone because you're sick of looking at your phone all the time?
Yeah, I think simultaneously there was a lot of excitement about these machines. One of the other things that they promised that I think we've kind of forgotten was such a big deal was the promise of telecommuting. There was a lot of like I kind of gestured at it that it became this idea of like, oh, now we can control our work, right? Now we can decide what kind of work we do and where we do it, and we can all be captains of our own ship, right? And a lot of, I would say, the economic energy behind the sales of computers was directed in that fashion, right? So there was this idea that now I can manage my own data. We didn't think of it that way, right, at the time, but it was like I can manage my own, I can have spreadsheets, and I can like turn them into graphs, and I can know how much money I'm spending. And those kinds of things people had never experienced before, right? They felt actually like earth-shattering. And so there was this, I think, kind of devil's bargain of, yeah, this machine amplifies me in all of these ways, so what I have to do is figure out how to negotiate these kind of new physical experiences that I'm having. Yeah, people were still psyched about the computer, but ultimately, corporations didn't want to lose right? What they were trying to hedge against was like sick days, basically, that employees would have to take because, back pain or eye strain or something like that.
You just wonder about like how long that honeymoon period lasts.
Oh, for the personal computer, that honeymoon period lasted until, I would say, like 1986, 1987. Now you're talking to a historian. Like real specifically, that was when everyone started to realize the thing that you promised us with this machine is actually taking way longer to happen than we thought it would, right? Everyone thought they were going to have robots by the 90s. That was a very kind of common idea of what like the computerized home or the computerized workplace would look like. And then everyone realized like, oh, that shit's hard. Like we don't actually know how to do that.
All right, I'm really wishing that my specialty was Pilates right about now. And Laine, I have no idea how you spied on my whole day. That was pretty, let's see. Pretty alarming. And you didn't even get to the smartphone and what those postures are. I just think I lost my eyesight completely in the 3 months that I spent in China looking at my iPhone 4, which everyone laughed at constantly. So thank you. That was pretty spot on. So I'm going to talk about a few different projects, starting with silk poems. So you can already observe my great posture here. Does anyone need to stretch?
Yeah.
I found myself like squirming back there. So when most people think of textiles, they think of clothes. But textiles can cross boundaries. My first weaving teacher designed weave structures for heart valves. The word text comes from the word textile, and I often work at the intersection of the two. My research-driven works weave together various disciplines, including text and textiles, poetry and art, science and life. They're closely attentive to material and embodied language, and they range considerably in scale, as I'll show you in a minute. I'm interested in feminist approaches to art practice, conversational and collaborative works, and in activating transdisciplinary conversations at the intersection of science, art, and technology. In the year-long exhibition Explode Every Day, an inquiry into the phenomena of wonder at MASMOCA, this work was presented along with 22 international artists, and the work was supported by a substantial grant from Creative Capital, who helped the project in many different ways. Silk as a material is 100% compatible with body tissues. Our immune system accepts it on surfaces as sensitive as the human brain. In conjunction with Tufts University Silk Lab's cutting-edge research on liquefied silk, I wrote a poem fabricated nanoscale in the form of a silk biosensor. In researching it, I consulted over 30 international nanotech and biomedical labs, textile archives, medical libraries, and sericulture sites in North America, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The documentary filmmaker, Charlotte Lagarde, who is also my wife now, traveled with me and recorded these research experiences. At the curator's suggestion, she made a short video about silk poems for MASMOCA. The piece is online, but I'll play some excerpts for you. Here's a quick map to show you where we went. In 2010, the journalist Amanda Schaefer had recently written an article on new developments in silk technology. And she had approached me with an eye towards collaboration, knowing my work in text and textile. We visited the Tufts University Silk Lab to meet David Kaplan and Fio Amanetto. We're working with liquefied silk and working to reinvent it as a cutting-edge biomedical and technological material. I focused on one instance of Fio Amanetto's research, the silk biosensor, which is implanted under the skin. And the nanopattern surface of the film allows it to work as an optical device, one that can be monitored visually through the skin. It can also be read as a projection with fiber optic light. Silk is universally biocompatible. That means that our bodies, anybody's body, will accept it on surfaces as sensitive as the human brain. When I first encountered one of these silk films in Fio's office, and I saw the Tufts logo and clip art, the content gap really surprised me. If you are living with a silk sensor implanted inside of you, knowing what is written, inscribed, or layered there could be quite meaningful, even transformative. I wanted to take the time to consider what might be written there and why, and to take this ancient textile material as subject and form in the silk poems. I took an experiential approach to research for the poem because I believed that I would encounter more that way. In Tbilisi, Georgia, we visited the State Silk Museum, which was once a scientific sorting station for silk for the Caucasus, where much of the silk for Europe was produced. So the raw silk is coming from the Caucasus, not all the way from China in most cases.
And this is a book about this station of teleculture. This is the main exhibition room, but the first time it was like this. It was not exhibition for guests. It was exhibition for scientists.
I'm going to just jump in and say that the project came back to that particular museum, and the poem was group translated by a bunch of Georgian artists. Silk Road, the trajectories are different. This one, I think, is probably my favorite one. It's from the National Silk Museum in China. It has no national delineation. It kind of returns all of these complicated boundaries into a different network. And I love this one because it's like Europe doesn't even exist in this map. And the European map, you have the whole landmass. It all seems to point to Rome and to Northern Europe. So the different orientations are so cultural. So it's been fun to see.
You have to use this one, use this tool, and put it on your shoulder.
In Tangshan, China, we visited a silkworm cooperative started by young intellectuals who had come from Beijing and returned to their family's village to start an organic, sustainable sericulture cooperative.
The silkworm is always eating, sleeping, and take off its skin. Take off one skin and become bigger and bigger, and so always eating, always sleeping, always like that. Yeah, and then wake up, going to eat again. We have to feed the leaves.
Are there any silkworm songs?
Silkworm what?
Songs? Like
Song?
if they're sleeping all the time? Do you
No. Yeah, and the shit of the silkworm.
Yeah.
We dry it on the sunshine and we give the ships to eat in the winter.
Really?
Yeah, because in winter there's no grass. So this sheep is going to eat this shit.
Okay.
It's traditionally this kind of system.
Yeah.
And the shit of the sheep,
Yep.
we're going to fertilize into the trees.
Wow.
The tree leaves of the silkworm, and then fertilize the trees, and the leaves were going to be eaten by the silkworms again. So this is this is a traditional Chinese culture, Chinese agriculture.
Okay. Yeah, jump forward a little bit. Agriculture, it's also a lab at any level, where even today in the biotech dimension. In thinking about how poetic forms might be shaped by the structure of silk, I looked at silk at the DNA level, where the building block of silk is the beta sheet. And beta sheets form just like the weft thread in a weaving. They snake back and forth. And when I visited the museums in Japan, I was so excited to find that that is exactly how the silkworm applies its filament in its cocoon. So the poem Strand is actually modeled after the image of how the silkworm writes its own cocoon. The 6-letter and jam line in the poem is coming from the genome sequencing, the 6-letter repeat in the genome. One thing that was very important in the development of the poem itself was the lineage of Islamic textiles and manuscripts. And within Islam, you have a restriction on the use of the image. So the letter and the word has a lot of responsibility to bear in communicating complex ideas. And one thing that informed the poem a great deal is that collapse of scale, how you'll see a large letter, but it's actually composed of smaller letters. That definitely comes from Islam.
Wow. It's really going to be tough to get an image out of this thing.
If you look through the microscope, you'll see gold letters suspended in what was once liquefied silk, dried into the form of a film. The poem is written from the perspective of the silkworm, and the addressee of the poem is the person with the silk sensor inside them. As a creature that lives no more than a month and a half, I thought it had a very valuable perspective, not only on the medium of the poem, silk, but also on mortality, which is one of the preoccupations of the poem. Okay, there's a view of the film under the microscope. That's what you see when you look through it. The video footage is of a reverse image microscope, so it's reversing black and white. So that's more like what you would have seen at the show at MASMOCA. When you zoom in, you can read on the XY axis, and you can read the poem in its 6-letter and jam form. I should say it's now a book. It's in a slightly easier form to read than the film. And let me see so through material history and material science, I've tried to relate biomedical innovation and a 5,000-year-old cultural practice. The poem takes the reader through the various stages of the silkworm's instars and life cycles, the history of silk, the material's presence in Chinese language and philosophical texts. As I wrote silk poems, I often thought of a quote I read by a Japanese weaver. "My clothes are my body, I do not loan them out. If I give them, I give them for good." And one by the poet C.D. Wright, "It is a function of poetry to locate those zones inside us that would be free and declare them so." It opens with an epigraph and preamble that I'll read. I should say that the book is written in a number of languages, primarily English and Chinese. And when you turn the page, the poem strand in the lower right maps out your reading location on the poem strand. So it's actual if you were to read it in a PDF format. And it corresponds to book history, to this convention you'd see as, in things like Shakespearean folios, where you see a tiny bit of the word that's going to be printed on the next page at the bottom of a prose block on the recto you're looking at. And it's a convention designed for binders who might have been illiterate to be able to collate complex textual sequences. And since I'm illiterate in a lot of languages, I now appreciate that kind of visual literacy. So it opens with a preface. I'll just read the 2 pages. "The wiggle of a worm as important as the assassination of a president," Agnes Martin. "It is said that silk filature began in China under a mulberry tree in a teacup, resting lightly in the slender hand of the empress, Si Ling Shi. A brin unfurls from the frisson tangle. She reaches in, begins to reel, filament from the soft envelope of the cocoon. That is how the people like to tell it. You know the Nigerian proverb, until the lions have their own historians, history will always be told by the hunters. If you don't know it, why not?" So then the silkworm proceeds to narrate a very long poem. And I made a few adaptations from censor into book. So the poem is also all caps, as it is in the genome strand, but you have a line with no spaces, so it slows you down as you read in a very kind of physical way, in an embodied way. And it's that way for a couple reasons. One, I like slowing down things. I think that's my great contribution to science. And also, silkworms don't take spaces when they eat through a leaf. They just keep eating. So there's no such thing as a space in silkworm writing, in my mind. And I wanted the poems to be in couplet form because it's a love poem, and I wanted them to look like worms, kind of, you know, with each other. And it traces a lot. It goes kind of deep into the radical for silk in Mandarin, and also makes some pretty great false claims about what the silkworms wrote within the canon of literature that I think are not that far-fetched. Okay. False, but not far-fetched. Okay, so river, I'm going to move to a new piece now. River is a geocentric model of the Mississippi River in hand-sewn silver sequins. The scale is 1 inch to 1 mile, and the piece spans 100 feet by 20 feet. Curvilinear, it's more like 230. It took the same amount of time to sew each section of the river that it would take to walk the real one. I've made sections over the course of 12 years. Here I was testing it out at the Rauschenberg Residency Studio, so you're looking towards the Delta. When it's exhibited for the first time in full this October at the Des Moines Art Center, it will be installed on the ceiling as planned and spill over onto surrounding walls. As I mentioned, the model is mapped from the geocentric perspective, so in the installation, the viewer's position is from inside the Earth's core looking up at the riverbed. I was born and raised in Iowa, on a river city on the path of the Mississippi. When I was 8, my family scattered my father's ashes on the bluffs overlooking the river. Toni Morrison writes, you know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places. There's a little break there. Occasionally the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use, but in fact it's not flooding, it's remembering. Remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. The archipelagos of the Delta, south of New Orleans, and the Gulf of Mexico are mirrored. Wherever the piece is exhibited, the people and the space around them will be reflected. I want to make works that create or hold space rather than take one away. Often this is a space where disparate fields can cohere and find meaning in touching, fusing, and thinking together. And to that I would add communities with this piece. You don't have to look very hard for these kinds of intersections. Here in this pile of sequins, I got curious about the future of this material, how the foil stamping on cloth will change over time. So I asked to book some time when I was at Northwestern University recently at the Nuance Lab to look at these at the electron level. So here you're looking at the hole in the center of a sequin, the surface of a sequin. And this cross-section shows that that stuff on the top that looks like snow is actually silver. So I've been touching probably millions of these things and still didn't know kind of the basic facts about what I'd been working with. It's a really unusual sequin in that it's foil stamping on a cloth backing. It's not like the celluloid sequins you might see on clothing you get today. So this SEM microscoped image is literally read by the periodic table of elements. So here's what it said about the sequin. It's 70% silver in the sampled area, 17% carbon, 9% oxygen, 3% sulfur, chlorine, and calcium. And what I learned that sort of would surprise me is that when I'm touching the sequin, when I'm sewing these one after the other, what I'm depositing through my touch is actually chlorine, which I would have never in a million years guessed. So I'm starting to think about touch in a very different way with that piece. Okay, so on to the next. So one vein of my practice is concerned with amplifying historic forms of female genius in the arts through creating contemporary works in public conversation with them. I worked with the poet Emily Dickinson, the weaver and printmaker Annie Albers, and more recently I'm working with a Chinese poet from the 4th century named Su Wei. I'm collaborating with Charlotte Lagarde and Violet Dufang, who are both filmmakers, on a new video installation focused on a Chinese poem written by Su Wei in the 4th century. I should say this title design is by a RISD graphic designer named Kiro Shi. So Su Wei's poem had 8,000 possible readings. She composed it in a 29 by 29 character grid, embroidered in silk in 5 colors in a scheme based on the Armillary Sphere. I should say that the 5 colors correspond to a philosophical system, the Wuxing theory, which corresponds to, you're nodding, which corresponds to planets, to directions, to elements, to numbers. It's a very complex system that the poem taps into in some ways. So this is a quick model of the Armillary Sphere and how it corresponds to the poem's substructure. So this is a Chinese invention in the 1st century, and it's used to chart the movement of celestial bodies. The original Cirque version of Su Wei's poem disappeared around the 12th century, and we've remade it in 2 versions. We approach it through the lens of traditional craft and contemporary Chinese women's perspectives and engage the poem as a literary work and as a textile. So through a 5-channel video installation, we're creating a form of community around the poem with a range of perspectives, not ours, contemporary Chinese perspectives, that says as much about female excellence in China today. There are a lot of layers to this work, and I can't do justice to them in a quick format. But if you're interested, there are a bunch of new samples on our site, and I highly recommend the interview with the algorithmic game theorist, who brings 5 different viewpoints to the poem that are all totally surprising and riveting, which makes me think that literary scholarship should really be completely interdisciplinary. We could learn a lot. Okay. I'm going to close out with some notes about what I'm doing with SETI, since it was mentioned earlier. I'm an artist in residence with SETI. I've been since 2016, and I think my term is till 2019 now. It's a program that facilitates a cross-disciplinary exchange of ideas between artists and scientists. SETI stands for Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And SETI scientists, if I may frame it in a very generalized way, study life in the universe across scientific disciplines. I love their motto, which is "We're listening." And in May, I have a SETI-related research trip planned, May, like right now, like next week. Planned to Tasmania and Australia to work with the Australian artists Faye and Devi on a new collaboration related to the dynamics of dissipated and concentrated listening through sculptural elements. So we're working with a rotating plinth that we've loaded with a repurposed feed from one of these telescopes. So you can't see it in the photo, it's the interior. And we're using it to bounce off ultrasonic sound projections within the installation. So imagine not a scale like this, but a scale more like the scale of this room. So the recordings will include stories of individuals and collectives of people dedicated to listening to ET signals. In the installation, people will move within and around the sonic beams that will be bouncing off the installation surfaces, encountering discrete stories with clarity at some moments and at other moments wandering into polyphonic disturbance as the beams carrying different stories cross over one another. Included in this installation will be field recordings from Tasmania and from SETI's Allen Telescope Array in Northern California. They'll include stories of one, Grote Reber, who built a parabolic antenna in 1937 in his Chicago backyard to try to listen to signals from outer space. He later moved to Tasmania, where he built an array in the backyard of a sheep grazing property, and for a decade was the only radio astronomer listening. So he was just out there in the field for a whole decade listening before the field started, which I just love that stuff. Okay, and there's another great scientist, Jocelyn Burnett. Do you know her? She built a radio telescope out of wire. She basically used like field fencing to make another really unconventional radio telescope. It's an outlier field. I love them. So the operational staff, we're also providing recordings from the ATA, the operational staff who monitor and maintain an array of small diameter radio telescopes at SETI's Allen Telescope Array, It's situated within Lawson Volcanic National Park in Hat Creek, California. And they are listening for anomalous stellar and interstellar signals. I'm also researching a project related to meteorites. I'm looking into what it would take to return one, to put it back into the part of space it came from. I just got this one, and it's from a witnessed fall in Siberia in 1947, and it's actually, like, for scale, it's about this big. Chinese literati regarded rocks, or gongxi, as objects of contemplation, a way to inspire their minds to wander the cosmos or sacred mountains and rivers. I love this quote in Kemen Hughes' book. Quote, "Today I've illustrated rare stones of the world into one book so that not only do the stones stand before us, but their spirit fills every studio and household." Recently, I visited the Field Museum's meteorite collection in Chicago. I should go back to that. I also learned that these sort of, these pockets right here, so this contains a different kind of material, but sometimes those pockets were filled with gas. So they actually, like, it's possible for a meteorite to fall from space and contain space, contain the gases from space, which sends me into a bit of a tailspin. So I went with the Northwestern material scientist David Dunand, who specializes in metals, to meet Philippe Heck, the curator of meteorites. And yes, there is such a thing. The collection is the largest after the Smithsonian in the States. So David is holding a piece of the moon, which is why he looks so happy. It's a very heavy lunar meteorite with some space weathering on the surface. I learned a few things. I know, scientist humor, it never gets old. One, you could tell time on a grand sliding scale using meteorites. So this collection is classified into two temporal groups, solar and pre-solar, as in pre our sun and after our sun is formed. There's one that I really like, that I'm obsessed with in Chile, that's like early sun, that's kind of right in the middle too. So anyway, this is the last slide. Two, it also resembles a deli at the Field Museum in that they regularly shave off slices of their meteorites with their diamond cutter for researchers with valid research requests and send them out by mail. So this, you're looking at a box of sample returns from a University of Chicago professor. So now I'm trying to, I'm just like, I'm having too much fun. I'm thinking about things like a meteorite clock that tells solar and pre-solar time, and I'm just like, I'm with them. Anyway. That's the end of the talk. It's exactly 25 minutes. I thank you very much.
Questions? Jen, that was marvelous. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Jen?
The poem on the silk membrane in the beginning, did that go into somebody? Like what, or can it? Will it?
I mean, you could technically you could eat it. It's thoroughly edible, digestible, and processable. It's not a biosensor, no. So the biosensor technology moved really fast. So I started looking at 2010, I made it in 2016, and by the time I exhibited, there was another technology in its place. So I actually remade it at Virginia with another scientist at a scale much, much smaller in 100% silk, but nothing's been implanted yet. So, and I don't think that this form of biosensor is the one that's moving forward. The biosensor technology is moving forward really quickly. And so I continue to follow that. And I'm interested in things like the Kirigami wireless sensors they're making at Northwestern and that sort of thing. But I mean, in some ways, it was more of a proof of concept to say, if this were the case, then how could we think about it? How could we deepen our relationship to body, subject, context, health, and so forth? So I didn't read any from the poem, but the idea is that the poem is something that stays with you if you're in that precarious position of monitoring your health every day, maybe in substitute of something like a regular blood draw, that you have this sense of withness. I mean, silk has a very long, intricate, interconnected history throughout the world. It connects so many cultures through deep time. And I feel like having that with you and having this, like, this voice of the silkworm is actually, it's not my voice. It's this very peculiar, very warm, funny, playful voice. And I feel like it's good company. It's like, it's more of in some ways, more of a talisman in relationship to that technology than anything. It's like there to be with you to it can't protect you, but it can give you that feeling of accompaniedness or withness, which is what I wanted it to do.
Any other questions? I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about? Can you talk a little bit about your background and how you make your way to these different kinds of technologies with your writing practice? Mm-hmm. Are you inherently a scientist? Like, no. Can you talk? There's that happening again. Can you talk a little bit about? Give us a kind of scaffolding mm-hmm. or a bridge between mm-hmm. your work in poetry and all of these technologies.
Right. Can we close that down for a sec?
Yeah.
My desktop isn't actually that clean. That's just special for tonight. That's haunting. So my background is not in science. It is what I wanted to do when I was young. I wanted to be a scientist. Actually, I had the idea that I would move into the fields relating to optics. So it's actually not that far-fetched. But then I went on to study first visual art and then writing, and wound up pretty squarely in the field of textiles in different ways. I mentioned a lot of my practice is research-based, so I like really substantial research topics, things that take a while, that take a lot of layering to get into. And I don't think I mentioned it, but I typically work kind of in the 4 to 12-year time frame with most work. So I let time be on my side to add those layers of complexity and also give me time to get up to speed on stuff that I don't understand. So I'm working with the newest scientists. I have new ways of making research records so that I can return to them. So like Charlotte filming on the Silk Poems research trajectory was really about creating a research record initially, and then it was later that Denise suggested making a video for the show. So I wanted to make like what I refer to as like a thick record. So with video, you can go back to sound and image, and you can retrace things that you don't understand. Like if the curator of meteorites mentions diamond meteorites in a particular context, and you just got stuck on the diamond part, then you can go back and hear the rest of the sentence. It's hard as an artist to not start thinking about what someone's saying and get distracted. So it was a way to not lose my train of thought. But I love research. I love libraries. I love librarians. And I love using my practice as a way to learn almost anything. Yeah. And then try to communicate and distill that for others. Yeah.
Anybody else, or shall we all have a beer and talk amongst ourselves? All right, thank you so much, Jen and Laine. This is really spectacular. Thank you. And thank everyone for coming.